I'll introduce Professor Dr. Anis Ahmed. He is a Muslim scholar from Pakistan. He's on a lecture tour between the 20th and the 25th of September. His lecture has been organized to highlight the importance of a positive Muslim-Christian relation as an extension to many such forums organized by the Center. Dr. Anis has spent decades in the Western world and has a wide exposure to interfaith dialogue. Currently he serves as the Vice Chancellor at Ripad International University in Islamabad and is a chairman of the Board of Governors of the Women's Institute of Science and Humanities. Dr. Professor Anis Ahmed has a PhD in comparative religion and Islam from Temple University in the USA and has served as a professor of comparative religion in Temple University in the USA, Appalachian University in the USA, International Islamic University in Malaysia and Islamabad. He is a former president of the Association of Muslim Social Scientists in America and an ex-member of the steering communities of the American Academy of Religions Islamic groups. He has also authored several books in different languages on Islam and contemporary issues. The first of his lecture series is titled Western Perceptions of Islam, Christian-Muslim Relationships, and it was going to be held here tonight. It should only last about 45 minutes to talk, and we'll follow it with a question and answer session. Should take about half an hour. And other talks that he's going to have are the challenges of globalization for Muslims, characteristics of a da'i, which means characteristics of somebody who invites people to Islam, Islam in a multicultural society, and leadership role of women in Islamic societies. And during his stay he will also deliver talks to schools, Islamic societies, and he is participating in TV interviews. And I believe he was on Bahrain TV recently, and apparently the program will be repeated this Friday at 9 o'clock, unless otherwise stated. That's the advice I've been given. It's being checked as we speak. So without further ado, I'll welcome Dr. Professor Anis Ahmed to come up and deliver his lecture to you.
رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Brother Chairperson, brothers and sisters, friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am greatly honored to be here this evening and share very briefly with you my reflections on this topic, how I look on Christian-Muslim relations and Western perception of Islam. I will try to keep my talk as brief as possible. Perhaps we should reverse the suggested scheme of the chairperson and talk about half an hour on this topic and have 45 minutes for question and answer session. That might be better for us. Then we can have feedback from you and have mutual interaction. The purpose of this talk is very simple, as mentioned earlier. I believe that we should not allow misconceptions, distortions, and confusion to continue. Confusions need to be corrected. And for that, it's extremely important that Muslims and others enter a dialogue and try to find out what is the root of problem and how we can get rid of these confusions. Usually, there are three approaches taken by Muslims when they talk about the West. First and foremost, people take a reactive approach where they want to react to certain issues raised by Western scholars and critics. In doing that, they quite often adopt a rhetorical manner in which Words are used to prove your points. Debates are created between people. A second approach is where people look in issues apologetically, and for that they go and try to present Islamic positions in context of history, and always say that, well, some time back Muslims may have done some kind of things, but now they are more civilized, more enlightened, and now they're no more doing all those things. They offer apologies for whatever they think are problems in the mind of the West. A third approach is that we better go to the sources and let sources speak for themselves. We ask the Quran and Sunnah and try to find out whether whatever is said is endorsed and supported by the Quran and Sunnah, or it is some sort of misunderstanding on the part of people who may not know very well Arabic language, or who may not have full grasp of basic concepts and teachings of Islam. I will try in these very last in these few minutes to take a detour, and in that I need your cooperation, your attention and participation, because I believe it's only by way of our interaction that we can reach a conclusion. I will try to look into the issues at two different levels. First and foremost, how does sources respond to it? And secondly, how you find all those so-called confusions meet the test of history. We'll try to find out in next few minutes how these confusions started, how these misgivings were created, and historically what is their root. You will find that in my discourse we'll be focusing essentially on three issues. First and foremost, the issue of violence, terrorism. Second, that which relates with present scenario in which people think that Islam is perhaps unfair to women folk. And lastly, that perhaps Islam is not compatible with contemporary political systems, particularly the so-called concept of liberal secular democracy. For that, to find out the history of confusion, we go back slightly in history, and you will find in this reference, which is from Martin Luther, the famous reformer in Christianity, who comes up and tells us it is a movement of violence in the service of the Antichrist. It cannot be converted because it is close to reason. It can only be resisted by the sword, and even that with difficulty. So it's no more a matter of George W. Bush or a few modern writers who have misconception. It goes back to pre-Renaissance period, pre-Reformation period. Before the Reformation started, this concept was there in the minds of a number of Christian thinkers and theologians. These distortions are recognized by a number of Western writers. You just looked into what Luther said, and now you go through this passage where a contemporary Christian scholar of Islam makes this statement. I quote, "Distorted portraits or caricatures of Muhammad ﷺ and Islam were created more accurately, fabricated with little concern for accuracy. Often beliefs and practices such as polytheism, eating pork, drinking wine, and sexual promiscuity, which run directly counter to its most basic beliefs, were attributed to Islam and the Prophet." Here you find a Western scholar very fairly and honestly confessing that there exist confusions, distortions and misgivings which have been created sometimes purposely and sometimes innocently. Let's try to find out how some other contemporaries look on the issue. And here you find Jerry Falwell, a well-known Christian evangelist, making a statement, I think Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was a terrorist. I read enough by both Muslims and non-Muslims. He was a violent man, a man of war. After making those statements, very harsh ones, on October 13th, he apologized in following words. I intend no disrespect to any sincere, law-abiding Muslims. We find similarly an advisor of George W. Bush making this statement, Islam is a religion in which God requires you to send your son to die for him. Christianity is a faith in which God sends his son to die for you. An interesting comparison, nice selection of words, but conveys a very clear meaning and message. Many Christians may question these statements because I think they will doubt very much, will God send his son to die for George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Ramsfield, and so on and so forth. Anyhow, another Christian missionary, a contemporary, says Islam is not a peaceful religion that wants to coexist. They want to coexist until they can control, dominate, and then, if needed, destroy. He further says, I have taken issue with our esteemed president in regard to his stand in saying Islam is a peaceful religion. It is just not. And the Quran makes it very clear, if you see an infidel, you are to kill him. This is how he looks on it. We also find another evangelist, Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, talks about Islam in terms of wicked and violent. Islam's basic teachings have a deep intolerance for those who follow other faith. Similarly, we find some of the media representatives making very harsh statements, such as this one. This man was an absolute wild-eyed fanatic. He was a robber and brigand. And to say that these terrorists destroyed Islam, they are carrying out Islam. Then the Quran, Islam's revealed text, is strictly a theft of Jewish theology. I mean, this man was a killer, and to think that this is a peaceful religion is fraudulent. Not only that, but even persons who are supposed to be more informed, like Pope Benedict, talks about Islam and says, Islam features a very marked subordination of women to men. It simply does not have the separation of the political and religious sphere that Christianity has had from the beginning. We also find this misconception mentioned elsewhere in academia, where it is said that Muslims were a threat to Western Christendom long before they became a problem. Similarly, you will find that some others, like the former Archbishop of Canterbury, in a lecture in Rome, has made the statement. However, whenever we look, Islam seems to be embroiled in conflict with other faiths and other cultures. It is in opposition to every other world religion, to Judaism in the Middle East, to Christianity in the West, in Nigeria and in Middle East, to Hinduism in India, to Buddhism especially since the destruction of temple in Afghanistan. We are presented therefore with a huge puzzle covering Islam. Why is this associated with violence throughout the world? These are just a brief sampling of how in academia, in media, and particularly those who are religious persons who represent their churches, who are supposed to be the carriers of peace and love to humanity, who are supposed to bridge differences and offer love and compassion to people, how they have used this kind of language with reference to some other persons who believe in peace no less than such preachers. The question arises, do we have a concept of holy war in Islam? You will find some high frequency terms used today with reference to Muslims, such as holy warriors, jihadis, Muslim militants, Islamic terrorists, suicide bombers, and fundamentalists. But if you look into Britannica, we find it tells us the term holy war is said to be a Christian term introduced in 1091 by Christian Pope to justify the use of force to convert Jews and Muslims. It was not a term which was used or coined by Muslims, and for that the term holy war, Harb al-Muqaddas, has no existence whatsoever in Arabic language, in the Quran, in Sunnah, or in any books of scholars of Islam. On the other hand, the word jihad, which has become a high frequency word, is used in the Quran around 40 times, and what it means is very simple. The term jihad, which is root word jahada, simply means to struggle, to strive, to make extreme effort in order to create justice, peace, to end exploitation, to remove insecurity. In other words, the word jihad is not a matter of militancy, but a matter of how you are able to create peace and order in society. Having said that, I'll try to share with you very briefly from the textual references how the Quran defines jihad, which has been called an act of violence in all those references we just glanced over. The purpose of jihad, as I find in the Quran, is essentially to have political and cultural liberation of people. And for that, I quote from the Quran in Surah Al-Hajj. It says, sanction is given to those who fight because they have been wronged, and Allah is indeed able to give them victory. Those who have been driven from their homes unjustly, because they say, our Lord is Allah. For had it not been for Allah to restrain some men through some other, monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques where name of Allah is honored most would have been raised. Al-Hajj, 22nd chapter, ayah 40. If you only look into this reference, you will find this Quranic passage refers to two outstanding facts. Firstly, that jihad is a matter of liberating those people whose land has been captured, who have been taken as prisoners, who have been made slaves, who are denied human rights. Secondly, if jihad or such an effort to remove injustice was not there, what will happen to people who have churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques? Remarkably, the Quran never said jihad means when a mosque is attacked, go out and kill the people. But it said very clearly, jihad is for the effort to make sure that churches are flourishing, that temples are operating, that mosques are busy, that monasteries are not closed down, in order to make sure that people have religious liberty, cultural liberty, Allah wants some people to correct others and remove all that is injustice, oppression and exploitation. I am not aware of a single text in Christianity, in Judaism and many world religions which will use terms referring to places of worship of other faiths and say, you are responsible to make sure people of other faith who go to synagogues and churches have liberty and no one is oppressing them. But here you find the Quran very clearly telling you that jihad is intended in order to allow people to have liberty to enter and go and worship and raise the name of their Lord, whether these are churches, temples, mosques or synagogues. A second reference that again tells us about what is the objective of jihad. It tells us, and I quote, how should you not fight for the cause of Allah and of the feeble among men and of the women and the children who are crying, our Lord, get us out of this city whose people are oppressors. Oh, give us from your presence some protecting friend, or give us from your presence some defender. When people are oppressed, men, women and children, and they cry, is it our human obligation to sit back and watch CNN and BBC and enjoy what's happening, burning of their homes, razing of their farms, killing of their young people, and we sit back? Or the Quran says, in such situations, when people, whether they are Muslims or non-Muslims, they face a crisis, when they are denied their human rights, then it's your obligation to stand up and make sure that you become their defenders, you protect them and provide them all kind of security. A third reference from the Quran. Here you find jihad has been further elaborated as a methodology, as a process in which you fight against evil, ignorance, injustice, exploitation, oppression and human rights violation, which may exist at economic level, political level, social level. So the Quran says, warfare is ordained for you and this you dislike. You may dislike a thing, yet it may be good for you. You have to wage a war against ignorance, against oppression, against devil, against all kinds of evil deeds, immorality. And therefore, it's not a matter of carrying Kalashnikov and hand grenades and body bomb, but it's a matter of that struggle, that effort, which is a demand of humanity. Humanity will lose its meaning if we allow people to be oppressed, if we allow them to be denied their basic human rights, if we allow them not to enter their places of worship. Therefore, all these aspects are referred by the Quran very explicitly to show what's the meaning of jihad. Not violence, not terrorism, but all that effort which you have to put in order to make sure that law and order, peace and justice prevails. Therefore, in this reference, the Quran says, and fight them until persecution is no more and order or deen is for Allah. With these few passages out of so many, I said there are about 40 places the Quran talks about. I picked up just a few to share with you how the Quran looks on the very concept of jihad. It's not a matter of violence and going out and killing people indiscriminately, but a matter of an organized struggle against all these evils in society. Let's try to find out, can jihad be linked with terrorism? And for that, we go to two sources, a normal source, a dictionary that tells us that terror means intense fear, quality of causing such fear, terribleness, or a party or group resorting terrorism. And then an expert, Walter Lecker, on terrorism, in his book Terrorism Reader, he says terrorism has been directed against dictatorships as well as democratic societies and has been practiced by extreme left, the radical right, and also quite frequently by nationalist, religious, separatist movements like Basque and Northern Irish Republic and many others. However, having looked into their definitions, we find that terrorism is closely associated with use of violence or physical assault on human beings carried out with intention of causing them horror, pain, and suffering. Because some acts which human beings resort to are not regarded terrorist act. If someone in the street punches you in your face and breaks your tooth, you call it act of violence. But when you have some pain in your tooth, you go to a dentist, he extracts it. You never call it act of terror. You call it an act of relieving. Your tooth has been removed, yet it's not terror. Jihad is not that blunt action where you go and punch people in their faces, but it's a matter of how you relieve pain, suffering, violence, exploitation from society, and therefore it cannot be categorized as terror. However, in this world of ours, we have seen with our own eyes policies adopted by world powers and big countries which resulted into death of millions of young children who could not get life-saving medicine, who could not get even milk, who could not get even fresh water. All these sanctions were never called terrorist acts. Ethnic cleansing in Bosnia-Herzegovina was never called terrorism. And pounding of bombs in Afghanistan for over a month was never called terrorism. Capturing a whole country in the name of export of democracy was never called terrorism. What a world we are living in, where you find all these things in front of you. These are innocent acts, but a term which was never designed to be used for violence has been categorized as terrorism. How do we conclude this brief discussion? Just 4 points. First and foremost, jihad cannot be categorized as holy war, aggression, terror, extremism, or militancy. Second, it's not a defensive war that when you are attacked you respond. It's not a reaction. It's a proactive methodology of removing evil, removing injustice and exploitation. Thirdly, it calls for a proactive approach in establishment of justice and peace in society. And lastly, it stands for realization of moderation, tolerance, and balance, eradication of ignorance, poverty, disease, immorality, and lawlessness. With all that much said on first point, which was emphasized by some authors that Islam is violent, beginning with Martin Luther, ending up with some advisors of George W. Bush, let's try to address ourselves to how Islam looks on interfaith harmony. Quite often a point is raised that Islam, its book, its messenger have heavily borrowed, rather stolen concepts from Judaism, from Christianity. The fact of the matter is, if you conduct a comparative study of world faith, you will find that there are certain universal truths which are common. I have yet to find a Buddhist scholar who will say Buddhism demands use of force and violence. I have yet to find a Christian scholar who will say Christianity means going out and doing crusades every morning. I have yet to find a Muslim scholar who will say that go out and fight indiscriminately, that's what Islam wants. Therefore, there are a number of universal truths that reside in most of world religions' teachings in their text. It's not surprising for me at all. Therefore, if Islam talks about certain issues and matters which are touched in Old Testament or New Testament, those concepts are not monopoly of one or the other tradition. Knowing this limitation of mind, knowing that human beings will think in these terms, the Quran goes and tells us what is the approach of Quran and Sunnah. For that, I just quote from the Quran which says, say, we believe in Allah and that which is revealed to us and that which was revealed to Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and the tribes and that which Moses and Jesus received and that which the other prophets received from their Lord. We make no discrimination between any of them, and to him we have surrendered. Here you find the Quran telling us that Islam is not a matter of inventing a new faith. It is essentially a matter of reviving the faith of Abraham, who precedes Judaism and Christianity. Therefore, the Quran says very clearly, Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but a person who called for undiluted, unadulterated, ethical monotheism, transcendent monotheism, not that monotheism which exists in some other world faiths, but he was the person who came up and said, I'm not going to accept any gods and divinities but my creator and creator of universe and humanity. Therefore, Abraham has been called in the Quran as one who proclaimed undisputed and undiluted Tawheed or oneness and uniqueness of his Lord and Creator. Having said that, Islam makes it very clear that whether you find some similar stories in Old Testament or New Testament is irrelevant, because Islam traces its roots to Abraham, who precedes the very historical existence of Judaism and Christianity. Consequently, when you relate yourself to source, origin, to patriarch, then automatically all these understandings become irrelevant, which have been mentioned quite frequently in the rhetorical talks of some Christian evangelists. Here you find the Quran telling you what I said a while ago. Abraham was not a Jew nor a Christian, but he was an upright man who had surrendered, and he was not of the polytheists. My last point relates with Islam's understanding by some people that it discriminates against women. And for that, we again go back to the Quran and find out how the Quran looks on the issue. The Quranic approach is very simple. It tells us, in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it does not matter at all whether you are a male or female. In cultures which have been dominated by male chauvinism, like the Western civilization, where it was always male who was dominant in every aspect of life, where women were marginalized until 20th century not even allowed right to vote in their so-called liberal democracies. Islam in 7th century comes up and tells us, each one of you, male and female, have an obligation to get educated, to speak up your mind in political matters, participate and contribute your share. Having said that, Islamic approach was that of transcending the so-called gender classification. Therefore, instead of defining mankind in terms of two genders, it talks about two ethical attitudes. One which is that of piety and goodness, and the other which is that of evil and immorality. Whether a male or a female, when moral, is to be rewarded. Whether male or female, when acting unethical, is to be subjected to punishment and condemnation. Therefore, the Quran in these two passages tells us, whoso does good work, whether a male or female, and he or she is a believer, such will enter paradise, and they will not be wronged the dint of a date stone. Similarly, it says, and the believers, men and women, are protecting friends one of another. They enjoin the right and forbid the wrong, which means very clearly that irrespective of their gender, they are going to be rewarded or punished based on their actions and not gender. Having said that, you will find that there are certain aspects which have not been properly highlighted and shared by Muslims themselves with their fellow Muslim friends and fellow non-Muslim friends. And among those are issues such as, if you read the Quran, you will find that it talks about Islamic law of inheritance, where you find the Quran telling you that for the leftover, you have to distribute the leftover in a manner that one share of a female and two shares of a male. Apparent discrepancy. You find in one place in the Quran, only one place, where it talks about when you are transacting monetary matters, in such transactions bring from among yourselves two male witnesses. If they are not available, then one male and two females, in order if one forgets, other will remind. This is what I quote exactly from the Quran. You find some other places where the Quran says that in case there is immorality committed, then call for more than one witnesses, specifically 4 witnesses. And people think that it is 4 male witnesses, while structurally in Arabic language it does not mean male, it only means 4 witnesses. With such statements in the Quran, anyone who is not aware of Quranic methodology, who does not know what is the implications of these statements, it's very easy to jump on conclusion. And one can say, since the Quran says have one male and 2 females as witnesses, therefore it equates 1 male to 2 females. While if you read the Quran, you will find it talks about different situations, such as if a murder is committed, then all you require is someone who is eyewitness and who was there. Does not say bring 4 females or 2 males. One single female who is witness at the time of murder is conclusive evidence. Islamic law never said if you have a dispute about childbirth, then bring 4 male witnesses. It always said the only lady who was there as midwife is the conclusive evidence. You don't have to call for anyone else. The Quran said if there is an allegation on the part of husband and wife, they distrust each other and they have reached a point where they have no evidence except their statement, then it tells us that either one should say just 4 times that this person is right, and 5th time say that if I am not stating what is truth, I may have curse of Allah. Never said men will say 4 times, women will say 8 times. If throughout the Quran you do not find these principles operating and in one single place it talks about it, that means it needs to be analyzed, understood and properly elaborated. Unfortunately, many Muslim scholars don't take time to address these issues because they are themselves bound in their traditions, in their narrow approaches which are taught to them in their seminaries, and not many of them come out and try to analyze Quranic passages directly. Therefore, an impression is created that perhaps Islam discriminates against them. Even the ayah that talks about bring from amongst you 2 male witnesses, and if they are not available, 1 male and 2 females, if you translate that into a reality, then you discover for yourself it does not equate 2 women with 1 male. Let's take a very concrete example by names of persons. In economic transaction, perhaps you have someone who is Zaid and someone who is Umar, and they want to have a transaction, and they cannot find many people around except Bakr, who is a male, and 2 females. One is Aisha, other is Saima, and after 5 years dispute arises. Aisha is not sure about it, but Saima is sure about it. What will be the judge's position? The judge will take Bakr, who is sure, and Saima, who is sure, and disregard Aisha. That means he will decide on 1 male and 1 female witness, and not that you don't have 2 females. We never translate concepts into actual realities. That create confusion. If you only apply Quranic passages and try to understand, you will not face that confusion at all. Therefore, even in that ayah, it does not provide an evidence that men have always more authority than women. Does not mean at all that in Islam men and women are declared gender equal. Gender equality is a concept which is essentially a secular concept, which is based on gender classification. Islamic approach is if a female carries more truth, more piety, more goodness, then she is superior to male, not equal, but superior to male. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not disregard her good deeds because she is female and say, no, you are only equal to male. But a person who has all his life been mischievous, while a lady who has been all her life pious and good, this lady has much superiority. Although in the so-called secular paradigm, you can hardly find the greatest concept of equality, while here it's not equality, it's transcendence, justice. Therefore, Islamic approach should not be confused with so-called mathematical gender equality, on which the whole case of empowerment of women is based in the West. Unfortunately, the conceptual basis itself is not strong. Equality itself does not mean you have justice. On the other hand, justice means when you have people given their due as they deserve, not based on gender, not based on a classification. Very briefly, that's how I thought I should share with you these ideas, just to open up the floor for questions, and I'll be available for your very strong disagreements, your very harsh critique, your very provocative and brutal statements. I am prepared for all those. Don't be polite. Try to be as frank and as harsh as possible in your words. Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I appreciate that you highlighted some of the issues that the press and others sort of bandied about to really sort of bring this down. I just have one maybe suggestion. As a social scientist as well, I get very concerned about sampling. So I apologize if I'm overly focused on the beginning of your presentation. Whereas I agree with you that the Western media and also those in power in Washington right now, George Bush, etc., are incredibly problematic in terms of understanding Islam. I think there are other voices in the United States and other activity going on besides just merely John Esposito, who's a scholar, so he's sort of a rare individual. He's really investigated this over many years of his life. But there are other sort of more regular people, more sort of regular, moderate Christians who have done an awful lot of work to try to get beyond these distortions. And in my own research, I did a post-9/11 study with a colleague of mine about the interfaith dialogue that went on, specifically by people who consider themselves professional mediators, arbitrators, facilitators, people of those nature in the U.S., and what they did to try to bring Muslims and other community members together to talk through some of these distortions and to understand each other. So there are some other voices, and I'll just give a couple examples. I won't go on too long. But for example, there's a joint Catholic bishop and Muslim group in the United States who, after 9/11, had a really well-publicized statement calling for dialogue and calling for not jumping to conclusions, understanding, to reach out to whoever the other is, and to not make assumptions, and that was powerful. Also, some groups like the Eastern Mennonites, the Quakers, some of these more moderate and open Protestant organizations have done a lot of cross-cultural dialogue. Now, it's not the loudest voice because of the political climate. It is definitely true that the evangelical Christians in the U.S. have a lot of power right now, but this is not going to last, in my opinion. And I would just hope that maybe in a future presentation, maybe just a couple slides showing that there are some people in the U.S. who, who are trying to get around some of these problematic distortions. Thank you. I'm sorry I went on so long.
I fully agree with you that it would have been better if we had more time and to cover more material. But the purpose was here to let you have a feel of how some of the Christian evangelists are talking about Islam today, and unfortunately they have more reach out as compared to those very moderate, concerned Christians who took hands with Muslims, who joined them after 9/11 in fighting against distortions. In California and elsewhere, there were efforts by various Christian organizations to go out and create a better environment for Muslims and for others to live together. I fully agree with you, but the purpose here was just to let you have a feel how some people are trying to create gulf. I think our approach should be, as you said very clearly, and as the Quran wants, to have an ongoing dialogue between Christians, Muslims, Jews and others, to look for common values, to think about a global ethical force of people who may be small in number but who may have more strong position. Therefore, the purpose was just to highlight some aspects. It was not supposed to be a conclusive, extended discourse where I should bring every single reference. I have for a 3-hour presentation where I have references from all those who are quite sympathetic, objective. I just picked up only John Esposito as one. And many others who have talked about it, but we with the constraint of time did not permit me to bring all those references. Yes, yes.
I think, well, you said you had not the time to draw a more diverse picture, but maybe it is not as beneficial as it was to draw such a monolithic picture of the West as you did, and as much too often done in this so-called dialogue, which I don't know whether it exists. On the other side, you complain about pictures which are drawn by Western people of the Islam. Of course, there are jihadists, there are terrorists who claim to do this, to behead people, to kill other Muslims in front of their mosque in the name of God. There are these people. You can't just tell us they don't exist because it's not written in the Quran that they should. They are there, and you have to just discuss with them and try to end this. Yeah? And not just draw the picture, the West is evil because they are intolerant and the Islam is good because it's written like this in the Quran. Both cultures are diverse and both need to discuss among each other and between each other.
Thank you very much. You see, you are partially correct when you are saying that perhaps the references I have given may make a person think that all of the West is like that. As I said very clearly, it was a sampling to let you know how some evangelists are doing the work. Nevertheless, to say that these passages were quoted in order to prove that some Muslims who may have acted violently are not acting was never the purpose. I never said that there is no Muslim in the world who has not acted violently. All I said was that let's go back to the sources to find out what does the source want. When we find in Northern Irish Republic a 30-year or 35-year conflict going on between Catholics and Protestants, none of the Muslim scholars ever said Christianity as such is a bloody religion, but they sympathized with those who were victims of terror. When in south of India there are acts of violence done in the name of nationalism and secularism, none of Muslim scholars have ever said that Buddhists and Hindus by definition are terrorists, because none of these faiths ever claim terrorism as methodology. Unfortunately, when a few Muslims act in unwise manner, then you find not only these few evangelists, but the whole of Western media, whether it's BBC, CNN, Fox, you name any, one single act is generalized and an image is projected as if Islam itself calls for. What you heard was that the God of Islam wants children to go out and fight and die for him. And this is a very bold generalization which is not based on facts. So my point simply was, let's try to find out from the scripture itself, the text itself, does it demand from Muslims to act in that manner? If it does not, and a few people act differently, then it is a localized act of persons, not a matter of Islam. Don't forget that when we talk about it, then we somehow overlook 58 years of ongoing terror against Palestinians is never counted, but one Palestinian who as a last resort goes out, explodes himself, makes a headline in newspapers and on television screens. We never try to find out why this crazy person acted in this manner. For him, there was nothing left in the world. His home razed to ground, his farm taken over, his land taken over, his family killed. So he thought he should lose his life as well. We never try to understand. On the other hand, a year back, a survey conducted in UK by University of Leeds indicates that 70% of Britons think Palestinians are infiltrators, Israelites are the real inhabitants of Palestine. Now, in this world, how can they think like that? Is Jewish presence there permanent or a result of migration from East Europe and elsewhere? These are facts of history. Yet, media has projected in a manner that those who were the real local citizens are projected as infiltrators, while Jews are projected as the real inheritors of land. Now, this is the problem of media. It's not only with one single aspect. You will find that quite often it is media projection that creates this kind of feeling. My purpose this evening was to share with you very briefly that Islam does not provide a basis for violence. Nevertheless, some Muslims, like some Christians, some Buddhists, some Hindus, may act differently, but no one has the right, whether a Christian priest or a scholar, to generalize on that and say that that's how Islam wants.
Okay, I actually would like to just add something here, because I used to be a Christian. I became Muslim several years ago, actually 9 years ago. And I've heard many people, Dr. Anis, speak along the same lines as yourself about the West is this and the West is that. And to some extent, I actually sympathize with the comments from the participant in the audience. There's a blended mix of reasons why people in the West draw the conclusions about Muslims that they do. And an all too familiar personality trait of Muslims is to blame the West as a collective body of people that are unthinking and are not dispersed or diversified in their thinking. There's a mix of blame. Muslims to some extent are to blame for the perceptions of people in the West, thinking that they are terrorists or thinking that they are male chauvinists. Many Muslim societies, Pakistan included, is a very patriarchal society. So when people in the West, from the UK or from Europe, look to these societies to try to understand, how do Muslims live, because they don't know the difference between a Muslim and Islam. They think all Muslims, because they are Muslim, are representative of Islam. Islam, we know, is a pure religion, and Muslims are better or worse at following it. So, there is some degree to which Muslims ourselves are to blame for these perceptions. And then it's all too easy for the media to apply any spin that they want to create the perception that they want people to believe about Muslims, because the already existing backdrop of understanding is there. It's a bed ready to receive these signals, whether they're accurate or not.
Thank you very much.
I would like to take a question from the guest over there.
Yeah, I just have some brief comments. First, with regards to whether Islam is compatible with secular liberal democracy, based on your demonstration regarding gender equality, I guess it just verifies the fact that there are certain elements which are not compatible. For example, the secular West views gender equality differently from how Islam does it. And the second comment I have is simply that I tend to be quite cynical about this whole interfaith dialogue, because each religion proclaims that its God is the God, and that everyone, and tries to refute the other religions. So I don't see how you can achieve productive dialogue when each side refutes what the other has to say. And finally, I guess that some people, not just the media, but actual people I talk to, tend to justify, for example, bombings that happen in Jakarta or perhaps in the UK or the US as a result of what's going on in Iraq or Palestine or all these places. But I simply find it irrational to link the two. I mean, what's the point of committing such a barbaric act thousands of miles away if you have a disagreement or a conflict with your own rulers, for example, or with whatever is going on? Then you should confront the rulers or whoever you disagree with. And finally, just perhaps it's not always the fault of the Western media for the distortions and the confusion that's created. Sometimes it's also the fault of Muslims, and as people and their leaders, they have contributed to the aggravation of the whole confusion by not clarifying what their religion actually says. So I just want you.
Thank you very much. You see, what you have said proves the point that when we have such dialogue, it is not fruitless. What you said as last point is extremely valuable. I think all people here in this auditorium will agree with you that we need to have an understanding, a common understanding on various issues. And I fully agree with you on the last point. Nevertheless, your first 2 points need slight elaboration. What I mean by compatibility is something different. West thinks that it has discovered an ultimate political form of government called secular liberal democracy. And it's not what I'm blaming on West, it's what Fukuyama in his famous book talks and tells us the end of history and the ascent of ultimate man. He tells us in very clear terms that now we have reached a point in history where Western capitalism and democracy have established themselves as the system which has to be accepted. The same is reinforced by Sam Huntington when he says that others have to understand development and progress is not just by doing things as we are doing, but it's also a matter of westernization. Modernization is incomplete without westernization. That's what he says very clearly, which means Western scholars have taken for granted the view that democratic form as it exists in the West is ultimate system. Then they come a step further and tell us that Islamic community or Muslims do not agree with democracy. Why? Because they begin from Morocco and end up in Jakarta and say either you have kingdoms, monarchies, army dictators or civil dictators. But one thing they forget is who has supported, patronized, introduced all these systems in Muslim countries. When elections take place in Algiers, who aborts the elections? Elections take place in Egypt and elsewhere. Who is behind supporting persons who are categorized as dictators? Therefore, certain anomalies exist. Although they claim they love democracy and they want to have democracy, but in countries where democracy is butchered, they support all those persons. They have red carpet receptions for army generals who are presidents of Muslim countries. They shake hands with them and declare they are their best friends. So this anomaly exists, and that's why I think it's not very simple to say Islam and democracy is incompatible. Definitely the kind which exists in Muslim societies is not Islam. Don't forget, Islam does not want that kind of dictatorship that exists by army rulers in some Muslim countries. The other point which you raise about dialogue, that people say they are ultimately true, I think that's not correct. I quoted from the Quran a reference which says that we believe in the original truth conveyed to people by Abraham, by Moses, by Jesus, by Isaac, by so and so, all names of prophets. Does it mean that Muslims believe only in one prophet and no other? Definitely there may be some faith who think they are right, Islam is wrong. But it's not the case of Islam at all. Secondly, even when Islam declares very clearly its Rabb or its Lord or its Creator is most powerful and transcendent, you may say that we have nearly same concept reflected in the Jewish tradition, where Yahweh is projected as ultimate. But added to it is the concept of chosenness, which makes it different. In Deuteronomy, it is said very clearly that I have chosen you as my people. And that's why if you read Jewish theology, you will find that the cornerstone of Judaism is this chosenness, that people who are always having their God on their side. Now Islam never said Muslims are chosen people. It said whoever, whether a Buddhist, a Christian, a Jew, accepts ultimate Creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, becomes a good person. Never said it's based on chosenness, ethnicity, Jewishness based on seed of David and so on and so forth. Therefore, some religions may have exclusivist approach where they exclude others. Some may have inclusivist approach who include everything and say everything that comes in becomes one and it's perfectly okay. Hinduism example. Islam is neither exclusivist nor inclusivist but interactive. It comes up and says, let's get together and talk and try to find out rationally, logically, empirically, historically, how should we live as a peaceful community. Therefore, its approach and message is slightly different than what is commonly understood by religions who believe in exclusivism.
I'm secular, so for me it's kind of difficult to understand. But then how do you attribute, I mean, some people argue that there's lots of violence if you read like Middle Eastern or Islamic history. You tend to have lots of battles, lots of warfare, which is not generally the case in the history of other religions. That's one of the arguments you tend to hear. So how can you, for example, refute that or argue that it has nothing to do with Islam and it's a characteristic of something else, for example?
You see, in 1948 and much before that, in early 20th century, a state declares a piece of land which it never owned belonging to a third people. Britain declares Palestine belonging to Jews which never belonged to them, and British never possessed that. Now that is the irony of history which led to an ongoing crisis in the area. And in that, unfortunately, many of the Western nations supported the idea of creation of Israel as against the concept of Palestine for Palestinians. Now that has led to an ongoing crisis in Palestine. The basis is both religious, cultural, historical, not just religious. But to refer to your point, kindly read 1500 years of ongoing religious war, 30-year war and many other wars between, and crusades particularly, and the ongoing inquisitions in Spain and elsewhere. They were not done in the name of secularity, in the name of Christianity, within Christian community, not just against others. So it's not correct to think that Islam and Muslims alone present something which is different. No. And this is a matter of human rights, not a matter of just religion. Palestinians have a human right to protect their land, their identity, their culture, which has been denied to them. And therefore, it should not be taken as purely religious, but I think it's a human issue. It's not a matter of Muslims and non-Muslims. But in Palestine, a large number of Christians and some very honest Jews do not believe in secular state, Zionist state of Israel. Therefore, it should not be just a matter of generalization on our part.
I think that was a very good answer. And just before we move on, in terms of Christian-Muslim dialogue, you know, I think it's in principle a very good idea, but the reality, the practicality, since you raised that point, and I'll be very brief, is that unless you can make the benefits of this filter down, work their way down to people like you and I on the street, ordinary people, if the dialogue is at the highest levels of contributors, be they politically high level or economically high level or academically high level, then you know, how on earth will it benefit most people? So practically it doesn't actually work in my experience, because ordinarily when you get people together talking about this, they're intelligent and knowledgeable enough already to form perceptions which are unlikely to change. Okay, can I take next question over there?
With reference to the interfaith, the friends were just now discussing, I'm from the place called Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and I've recently been participating in the interfaith, and I've seen the Muslims and Christians, Hindus, and many other religions has been practicing very harmoniously in order to establish the peace and unity among themselves. Of course, when we talk about the difference and the fight and wars between different religions, it will go on and it cannot be stopped. But one great thing I have noticed in the interfaith that whenever there is a difficulty, all the religions join together and they try to support and solve the problems. And they also have a yearly events where they all come together and present their own religious beliefs, and they give a very good unity concepts. I believe we should have some sort of interfaith organizations in Bahrain, so that we'll be able to, you know, come together and establish unified forms. What I'd like to conclude is, first of all, besides talking of the international fight and wars and holy books, writings and contacts, we should try to establish unity among all the races, all the religions, and try to agree to each other by, you know, getting together, sit down at a table and, you know, I mean, serving the community, or, you know, eating together or something like that. This kind of a simple basic we should try to establish before we talk about the world issues. If anybody like to know more about the interfaith, I would suggest that yearly there is an event taking place in Malaysia. If you just go and sit down there, and if you just see how they organize and how the other peoples move around, you will think that you're living in a different world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very good idea, and I understand Bahrain represents a part of world where people from different faith and culture live together, and Islam particularly is concerned about such plurality. It does want people of different faith to live together in peace, with respect, dignity and honor. That's why I refer to Quranic passage which says that Muslims have an obligation to make sure that churches, synagogues, mosques all keep on functioning. That speaks for interfaith approach, plurality of religions within the Quranic text, not just something coming out of contemporary discussion, but it's what the Quran says very clearly. And I think Muslims have an obligation to make sure that they have an ongoing dialogue with all people of the world.
Okay, we had one question put to us on this piece of paper. It says you have quoted many statements of Christian leaders and did not mention about what Muslim leaders have said about Christians in the West. So essentially defamatory statements about Christians in the West.
Yeah, thank you very much. You see, I'm not aware of any scholars who have come out with allegations on the West. However, there has always been an analysis of Western concepts and philosophies, including Christianity, capitalism, Marxism, fascism, you name any ideology. Muslim scholars have worked and published scholarly books on those aspects, but I'm not aware of people who will say Christianity is bad, Judaism is bad. I'm not aware of a single quotation, and I would like to be enlightened and educated. I would like to find out who among Muslim scholars have taken up this task of defaming, blaming, or attributing things on Christianity. They have always talked about justice, they have talked about some problems in the West, and they are very frank in that. They have not hidden their feelings about certain Western ideologies. Iqbal, for example, from my country, Maududi from my country, many others in the Middle East have come up. The Algerian bin Nabi has great critique on Western thought, Western philosophy, Western ideas, and many others. So they have come up without any inhibitions about disagreement with the Western culture, and I think that's a human right of everyone to critically examine and disagree, but not to disrespect, not to dishonor. On the other hand, we find that if one single Christian ever talks low about Sayyidina Isa or Jesus, peace be upon him, Muslims feel hurt. It was Muslims who staged demonstrations and went out in the streets when some movies were made in which Jesus was projected as not a very upright person. Muslims protested on that. So it's not a matter because Muslims are required by the Quran to declare and to believe Jesus as true prophet, Moses as true prophet. They cannot afford to talk about them in any derogatory manner. Then they lose to be Muslims. Therefore, it's not easy at all. Nevertheless, in Christianity, if there are some problems like dogma, so does many Christian scholars. They have taken up the task and they have challenged what's the meaning of dogma, what's the meaning of certain aspects of Christianity which they call puzzles, theological enigmas. All those things are done by scholars of Christianity as well as some Muslims. Does not mean they are going to call Christianity with words which have been used by some authors about Islam.
Okay, we've got time for one last question.
Sir, according to Quran, in the matters of transactions, 2 male witnesses or 1 male and 2 female witnesses are required, so that if a female forgets, the other will remind. Does it mean that in the eyes of the Creator, a woman has more possibility of forgetting an incident as compared to a male?
No, you see, it's not a reflection on women's power of retention, because you find that among the companions, one of the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him, Sayyida Aisha, has conveyed to us a large number of traditions, and no single critic of hadith has ever said that since she is the only lady to report to us, perhaps she may have forgotten. Having said that, when the Quran talks about human beings, it wants to be very fair, honest, and also want to be verifiable. We know better than others. I forget a lot. If you ask me for the birthday of my youngest daughter, I may not be able to give you exact date, and she is quite often angry on me when they don't remember. That does not mean all men are like me. Similarly, there may be some women who have extremely strong memory. But what the Quran refers here is a biological fact where in some stress situations male are not undergoing regularly in that stress, while female may go under that stress. Biologically, there are periods of stress, and therefore, if in such situations a person is not sure about it, why should you put this person in trouble? Why not make sure at least there are two persons, one of them is not going through that tension and has been able to have clear remembrance of the event, therefore keeping in view a possibility. You see, you should not forget Islam looks for the maximum security of the person who is involved in transaction, and for that it should try to eliminate such possibilities which might create a jeopardy for the person. Therefore, the Quran has said that if one, now there are possibilities when you have two male witnesses and both forget, quite possible. Should the Quran put a list of 99 cases that in this case 5 men forget, in this 3 women forget, therefore we take a mean and make following thing? It's not a book of mathematics or jigsaw puzzle, but a book of principles. So it gives us a general principle that if you have a situation where you can find 2 male persons who are known to you and who can retain whatever is taking place in front of their eyes, and you cannot find 2, then have at least 1 and 2 women to verify. So the issue is to make it more verifiable, more accessible, and not a reflection on the very nature of memory of women. Otherwise, you will not find so many ahadith and so many things narrated by one single woman and taken as fully authentic by Muslim scholars.
Well, thank you for that. I think that brings us to a close for tonight.